Good morning. Good morning, everyone. We're excited to have you guys here. We're gonna wait like maybe another minute or two and see if anybody else pops in, but we are recording, so if anyone comes late or leaves early, we'll be able to give you access to that. Well, as you come into the chat, can you put like your preferred name, what program or residency you're with, and what the focus area of your program is into the chat, just so we can get a sense of like who's here, what you guys are all working on. Well, I'm going to get us started just because we have a lot of amazing content to cover today, and I'm just here to introduce our amazing speakers. We are going to start today with a mindful minute and just kind of norm setting. Then I will give you a little bit of background, not a ton because I don't have a lot of time, but we could talk about equity and mentorship all day long. But I'm going to give you a little bit of background on that. And then I'm going to pass it off to one of our amazing speakers, Dr. Nadia Bennett. She's going to talk about equity work that creates change. And then we'll have a short break. And then we'll pass it off to Dr. Kirsten Northenskold, and she's going to talk to us about the mentorship stances in her research, which is also incredible and a really good framework for all of us who are thinking about how to develop our mentors in our educator preparation programs. And then we'll wrap up. So I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Heather Michelle for a quick mindful minute.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Heather Michelle. I'm the director of the Residency Lab. Super excited to be in space with you all this morning. One thing that we want to do at the lab is really support this idea of mental health and wellness, not only for the residents that you are serving, but also for yourselves as equity leaders. You may have noticed in our email blast that we are including a short moment there for wellness. And when we come together in spaces like these, we also want to just spend a short, quick amount of time really just centering our wellness and normalizing that focus on yourself and in service of your own sustainability in equity work. And so today we're going to spend about 5 minutes doing spending some time doing some breath work. This is a breath work exercise brought to us by Brene Brown. If you're familiar with Brene Brown's work, you may have done this exercise before. The great thing about breath work is that it regulates your stress response. Stress is something that we all deal with on a regular basis. Equity work is hard. And so breath work is great because it's accessible to everyone. It's right there inside your own being. You don't have to spend any money. You don't have to do anything different. It's really just something that you can focus on yourself inwardly, even as you're experiencing stress outwardly and perhaps in your environment. And so the way this works is I'm going to do a count of 4 seconds. You're going to breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for a count of 4 seconds, and then you're going to breathe out for 4 seconds. And you're going to hold it. And then we're going to repeat it. Breathe in, hold, breathe out, hold. And I'm going to count you through it and kind of lead you through it. I'll lead you through about 2 minutes. And then I'll set a timer and have you breathe on your own for the remainder 3 minutes. What I would ask you to do, because I've led this exercise in other spaces, is that sometimes people get like anxious about the prompting that I'm telling them. Honestly, it's just about breathing and taking a moment to relax and centering your breath and really focusing inward before we engage in this important work together. So please use my voice as a guide. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to go ahead and turn off your camera. Relax in your chair. You can lean back all the way in it. Make sure both of the soles of your feet are on the floor. Relax any part of your body that may be tense. We carry tension in our shoulders, the back of our back. Sometimes even our tummy will feel tight, or even in our throat. So take a moment, just take a deep breath and relax all parts of your body. Doing a little body scan from the top all the way down to your feet. And I'm going to ask you to breathe in for a count of 4 seconds. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4, and hold. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Breathe out. And hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4. And hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. And hold. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. Hold. Breathe in. And now I want you to continue breathing at your own pace, at your own rate for about 2 more minutes, and then we'll bring you back. Okay, I'm going to bring you back. You can turn your cameras back on. Hopefully that was a relaxing experience. I know that when I do this with my kids, they're like, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, you're going too fast. So hopefully you had a good experience, and it just centered you and gave you a moment to relax as we engage in this important work. And I'll pass it back to Kate.
Thank you. So before we get started, I just want to give some context about who we are, our team here at the lab. We have Ed Honowitz, who is on the call. He is our CEO and leader of all things at the CDE Foundation. Dr. Heather Michelle, who just led our amazing breath work. She is the director of the Residency Lab. I'm Dr. Kate Herman. I am the associate director. And Allison Roberson is going to be monitoring the chat and engaging with all of you. And she's our incredible new residency specialist here at the lab. So as Dr. Heather Michelle said earlier, equity work is hard and it requires safety. And so we ask that you just review quickly and commit to these 8 norms for our time together in this space. We just want to make sure that everybody feels safe to share and reflect and ask questions that maybe are hard questions. So I'm not going to read all of them, but that's the stage I'm setting here is just we want to make sure that we're fostering a safe environment. At the lab, most of you probably know, but we frame our work using the 10 characteristics of effective residencies. And the focus of our mentorship equity deep dive sessions are likely going to touch on all 10 of these, but they're going to focus primarily on 1, equity, 8, mentorship, and 5, effective hiring practices. And if you have questions about the characteristics at any point, you can basically email anyone on the SRTAC or TRL team because it's like really the center of all the work we do here. So I want to start by talking about equity in the space of residencies. This series started in 2018 with Dr. J and Dr. Travis Bristol as the Equity Deep Dive series. Our work at the lab continues to be centered in equity, and that is the root from which this series was born. I found this graphic from the National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity, which depicts their framework for the importance of diversifying the STEM educator workforce as it has a direct impact on increasing student outcomes. This graphic really resonated with me though because of the similarities between the teacher and student relationship and the mentor teacher and resident teacher relationship. Mentor teachers really do need to be developed using a similar framework so that they can support their resident teacher as they enter the profession. And if you know me, you know that I always try to find the data. So why do we do this work in the educator preparation space? I always want to know, like, what is behind the decisions that we make? Most of us in this space know that the residency model is an effective way to diversify your local educator workforce and address shortage areas in your communities. But why do we want to diversify the workforce? We know that students learn better and have better outcomes when they have teachers who look like them. But if you look at this breakdown of the student demographics compared to the teacher demographics across the state of California, you can see easily that they don't match. The residency model is one way to address this need, but it also means that your mentor teachers likely also do not match the demographics of your incoming diversifying resident teachers. It's really important to keep tabs on your district or community's needs because they all differ. And this graph specifically shows the overall student and teacher population of the entire state. By comparing data from your communities, you can begin to identify the areas which you should be recruiting your future teacher candidates from and support the development of your mentor and resident teachers in your programs. And as part of membership with the lab, we will be supporting you in that data collection and analysis for your program. Through coaching with one of our experts on this call and for the rest of the 4 series, and additional support from lab leadership, you're going to identify specific data sources to help you make those actionable decisions to affect the recruitment and retention of your teacher workforce. You'll identify types of both quantitative and qualitative data that tell your story of your program, and identify highlights of your program to bolster and target areas where professional development supports may be. I want to introduce you really quick to the equity pause if you've not heard of it yet, because they're going to be integrated throughout our session today. An equity pause really just is an opportunity for reflection, and we hope that you'll meaningfully engage and maybe even take this structure to add to your own programs. When you're prompted by a presenter, an equity pause may focus on one or more of these questions. It's an opportunity for you to pause when decisions are made or topics are discussed and consider any unheard voices or perspectives. So I want to give a very brief overview of why we chose the topic of mentor teacher development for this spring series. Mentor teachers hold a lot of power in the residency and in educator preparation space. When they collaborate effectively with their resident teachers, research has shown that this has positive effects on the residents' experiences, which leads to retention, sense of belonging, and increased self-efficacy for teaching. It is important for us all to focus on the development of our mentors because they're the ones spending the most time with our residents. The relationship between mentors and residents is not very well studied yet, but I found 2 studies that outlined what makes an effective mentor for new teachers. What's interesting here is that one is from the school leader perspective and one is from the student teacher perspective. The teacher candidates really wanted their mentors to provide personalized support, practical guidance, and a trusting, collaborative relationship. They really wanted to feel seen and valued. But administrators, by contrast, appeared really to focus more on systemic and procedural aspects of mentorship, with less emphasis on the nuanced interpersonal and instructional qualities that are emphasized by the teacher candidates. This misalignment really could lead to ineffective mentor-teacher pairings and development, and then a lack of clarity in the mentoring process. And that leads me to why we have this series. Residencies across California, as some of you put in the chat, are really doing the hard work of recruiting teachers of color. And we are working really hard to retain those people to the field. We know that mentor teachers have a significant impact on resident teacher experiences and shape their perspective of the field before they even enter it. We're really excited you're here because we want to make sure that you have the tools to support your continuation and refinement of the work that you're doing. Our series of mentorship deep dives are going to focus on just that, how to design your mentor development program within your organizations that's going to support on the recruitment and retention of a diverse teacher workforce. You're going to be exposed to real tools to help you collect, make sense of, and take action from the data in your specific program. You're going to understand mentorship stances and how to train your mentors to be responsive to the needs of their residents. And you'll receive holistic coaching curricula to strengthen the care and the heart of the mentorship that you foster in your programs. And lastly, you're going to gain access to real resources and training tools to help your mentors practice their coaching and mentoring skills before they even start working with their residents. What are you guys hoping to gain from your participation in this series? And I'm going to introduce you guys to our first presenter. Dr. Nadia Bennett is a visionary leader in education and the founder and CEO of When Brown Girls Lead, a consulting firm dedicated to fostering equity-driven schools and districts nationwide. With a mission to empower educators through culturally relevant leadership development, Dr. Bennett equips them with the tools to create anti-racist and inclusive learning environments. Her track record speaks volumes. As a former charter superintendent, Dr. Bennett led transformative improvements, doubling ELA scores, revitalizing struggling districts, and achieving substantial gains in attendance and staff retention. Before that, she made her mark as the principal of Simon Gratz Mastery High School, where her data-driven strategies, effective teacher development, and restorative practices elevated the school to the top of Philadelphia's charter rankings. Dr. Bennett's passion for dismantling systemic barriers is rooted in her own academic journey. She holds degrees from Dillard University and Howard University and refined her expertise through the Urban Superintendent's Academy with AASA. Her commitments to educational excellence culminated in her doctoral studies, reinforcing her dedication to creating equitable opportunities for all students. Through her consulting and coaching, Dr. Bennett works tirelessly to close the opportunity gap, shaping schools where every child can thrive and every educator can lead with purpose.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here with all of you wonderful educators today. For the opening of my session, you're going to need your cell phones. So if you could take your phone and scan the QR code here, there's a survey that's going to pop up, and I'm going to ask for everyone to take the survey. And we're going to observe. I'll give you a couple seconds. Once everyone has scanned it, we're going to observe the results as they come in. So we have, okay, well, numbers are changing, so let me slow down as the numbers change. All right. Right now, leading, we have treating equity as compliance task, not personal change linked to culture, identity, and healing. Beautiful. Okay. So right now, remaining in the lead is what we call doing equity. Well, now look at that, guys. You're still taking it. You got me jumping all over the place. I'll hold on another second because boomerang equity is right behind and jumping ahead. All right. Understanding equity challenges, but reverting to status quo solutions after initial efforts. I would love for someone who selected that as what they're most commonly seeing within their program. If you could raise your hand and share with us, what results have you seen from the boomerang equity, which is reverting back to status quo? What are the results that you're seeing with that being the primary go-to for your program? I did not say this coming into the session, but engagement is really important when I'm presenting. I have to know what's going on with you guys. I gotta hear your voices. Your voices are incredibly important. And I used to be a teacher, so I am absolutely okay with awkward wait time. Right? So if you could just share really quickly, what results have you seen as a result of the boomerang equity?
I left because of it. I left a whole program. I had to leave because of the work that we were doing was so grounded in equity and access, but the larger organization would boomerang it every time. And we just became stagnant, and it was difficult when you're solo doing some of this work in an organization that doesn't uphold the same values as you.
So thank you very much, Brooke, first of all, for being the first courageous person willing to share. So let's clap it up, give some silent claps for Brooke. And unfortunately, your experience it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon. It sounds like it was a combination actually of boomerang equity as well as a siloed kind of equity, in that you felt that you were the only person truly committed to the work. Thank you so much for sharing that. I would love one more person to share some of what you observed and some of the results that you experienced with lackluster efforts towards equity. All right, someone's dropping in a chat. All right. Marissa shared, when it comes to residency, building community is such an integral part of the experience, and then educators join systems that don't cultivate that. Teachers are left isolated and without a sense of belonging. I am in full agreement. Kate mentioned this just a minute ago regarding the teachers wanting to feel seen and valued, right? But that not necessarily being the primary focus for the leaders in the school. The reason that I had us start that way is because we have an opportunity in California and nationally to come face to face with the reality of the change that's needed. And for this, I put here the James Baldwin quote, which you may or may not have heard of, is that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. The reality is we do have a national concern in which people are either doing equity one of two ways. They are skipping over the personal transformation that's needed to create true and long-lasting change, or they are hyper-reflective and talk about equity all the time, but they don't actually put anything into action, right? And then we have a group of organizations, schools, programs that aren't even doing that. So we continuously get the same outcome because of the way that we're approaching this work. And if we want a different outcome, obviously we have to approach the work differently. And a part of my time here with you guys is to expose you to potentially a different way of approaching this work to get different results. We're going to have what I refer to as a moment of reflection. So I just mentioned true effective equity work. It's two-sided. You have the personal transformation in which individuals really dive into self-reflecting, understanding the history of racism and bias, et cetera, within this country. And then you have the action component. A part of the personal transformation is, as I said, understanding the history and self-reflection. We're going to have 3 slides coming up, all of them moments of reflection. A paragraph is going to pop up. You're going to read that paragraph independently and then answer the question in the chat, okay? Going to read the paragraph independently and then answer the question in the chat. This is our first one. We're going to go ahead and get started. I see some of you have started to type and put your responses in the chat. This is an example of structural racism and shows the long-lasting, deep consequences of that impact. Agreed. Marissa, for one, why would Black people want to even consider the teaching profession because of that history? What would be the incentive after such trauma? Excellent point. Taking the trauma and the mental struggle that comes with such an experience. Makes me think about the different narratives that are told. This is an impact of Brown v. Board that isn't talked about widely, which is a disservice. Allison, I'm going to have to go ahead and cold call on you because I would love for you to talk more about that and kind of unpack that for us a bit. Would you mind?
I'm happy to share. I think for most of us, like when we hear Brown versus the Board of Education, we think, that was the thing that desegregated schools. This was a moment of like progress in our country, and we think about it more as a positive thing. I can tell you, like when I was taught about this in school, that's absolutely how it was taught to me. And then later in life, learning the impact that this had and the amazing educators that were pulled out of schools, especially educators who had similar experiences to students who are now really lacking sense of belonging in school. And so I think for me, when I first learned this detail, it was a moment of unlearning, a moment where like the history that I was taught in school really missed a key piece of like who was impacted and the long-term impact that it had.
Thank you so much for that. Now, there are educators and researchers that would say that this aspect of Brown v. Board was left out intentionally, right? Because people control the narrative, right? And to control the narrative, we want it to be presented as something that was positive versus the consequences that also came along with that. There are some researchers that also believe that it was at this moment that the expectations for Black students particularly is when it went on a decline, right? Because white educators at that time in the history of this country, it's almost to be expected that they wouldn't expect much out of Black children intellectually because of where we were as a society and a country. And so there are researchers that believe that when our challenge that we have right now, which is adults having low expectations for students of color, it started at this moment when Brown v. Board was put into place. We're going to go to the next moment of reflection. Again, read the paragraph, and then if you'd be so kind as to answer the question in the chat. I do want you to pay particular attention to this person's job title, and therefore consider the influence that they've had. As a former special education teacher, this makes me crazy. The assessments used for IQ are known to be biased in terms of race and class. If your tool is racist, your results will be racist too. Thank you so much, Kelly. I appreciate that insight. Dr. K, you mentioned an awful internalization of supremacy. That language in particular, I think, is incredibly important in that it speaks to how we are socialized, what we are socialized to believe, and how we can unintentionally perpetuate beliefs that are not true and that are harmful to people of color. Okay. We have one more to reflect on. Take a moment, everyone. Please read the paragraph before you and then answer the question at the bottom. This is our last one. The lens in which people view the world will impact their opinion on how they approach hiring. Hiring practices are always based on if you are a good fit for the organization. The good fit approach leaves room for bias and subjective systems that are racist. For me, this quote emphasizes the importance of doing the internal work. Bias are strong indicators for hiring. Research has been done that found that you are more likely to hire those that look like the hiring committee. If the hiring committee is white, it's most likely a white teacher will be hired. Dr. Michelle, would you mind unpacking that a bit, talking a bit more about that research?
Sure. It was actually a study, and I don't have the citation off the top of my head, but it was in regards to college and university campuses and how hiring committees that were doing a nationwide search, even if they had a diverse pool of applicants, they oftentimes reverted to the person that most looked like them and most resonated with their own personal experiences. And so I think we privilege our own racial identity in hiring processes and also candidates that most reflect who we are. That becomes problematic when leadership in K-12 and also in higher education institutions continues to be white. If we're looking to diversify both K-12 and higher ed, we really need to be putting people of color in those positions of power to really change the makeup of the school systems that we're creating.
I agree completely. And the most interesting thing that often occurs when we don't do that is then, because I work with schools nationally, and then the response will be oftentimes, well, certain people aren't applying, or we don't know how to reach certain people. It becomes unintentional, because I do believe the majority of these things in educators is unconscious. It becomes a blaming of the oppressed, right? Blaming the oppressed for the systems that are set up and situated to do exactly what they're doing, which is to oppress them. I would love for everyone on the call to just take a moment and consider, we just did 3 quick slides, right? We did a slide of the historical context. We did a slide of the influence of people in power. We did a slide referring to how the human brain works. All of which are things that influence and continue to impact where we are in education today and how that's playing out for both adults in education of color as well as students of education of color. You put such great comments in the chat regarding number one, wow, this history really helps me to better understand in regards to the Black educator workforce not recovering. The frustration that's experienced when people of power have implicit bias and negative beliefs for people of color, and then understanding how the human brain works. I began that way intentionally to show the power of first starting with the personal knowledge building and personal transformation, right? When we're considering equity change that works, we have to, again, begin with first giving people information and knowledge they may not be considering before we expect them to jump in to change systems and actions and policies. If you only change the policies, you're going to revert back to the status quo. We got to remember, people, human beings, us, we create, maintain, and perpetuate systems. We do that. So if there's no change on the personal level, that system is going to do exactly what that system was created to do. So in all equity work that you're engaging with, it's a twofold process: personal transformation, and then we can get to the systemic pieces. Now, in moving to the systemic pieces, I'm going to share with the group my five-step approach that I use with my organization, in which I support schools nationally around anti-racism and equity work. This five-step approach includes some of what we just covered, and then it goes into the systemic change. So this process regarding change and equity that works, you want to start with that quantitative and qualitative data, right? And so the qualitative data is anything such as student surveys, teacher surveys, parent surveys, observations, etc. The quantitative data is looking at the numbers, which we often do in education already, right? We're looking at the comparison of our BIPOC teachers versus the student body, right? We also look at the academics for young people, behavior, quantitative data, etc. We want to look at both quantitative and qualitative data, which I'm going to unpack for you in a second. And then we go to understanding the why behind the data, people taking responsibility for the data. In our age, in our generation as educators, we did not create these systems, but we do have the responsibility of changing them, right? Then we move to the practical and systemic change and so on. For the purposes of our time together today, we're going to just touch on those first two steps because we're limited on time. We're going to touch on those first two steps. So number one, knowing the data. So we start with our quantitative data. Our quantitative data tells us the what and not the why, okay? So your quantitative data is similar to what Dr. Kate presented in the beginning. She showed you how the number of adults that identify as people of color versus the student body. Ideally, those numbers would reflect each other, right? So meaning that if you have 15% of your young people that identify as Latinx, you would at least have 15% of the teaching force, mentor force, et cetera, reflecting that same 15%. If those numbers do not exist that way, then there's typically a disparity. Other numbers within education that, again, we look at, and if you're particularly with mentor teachers and them supporting newer teachers, you're always going to be looking at academics. We have the interim assessments. That could be anything from like if they're doing benchmark assessments, iReady, MAP. There's so many different interim assessments, and then you have your standard state assessments. You also have course grades, right, to see how students are performing in actual courses. Student behavior and specialized services, looking specifically for the overrepresentation of students of color, right? That's where we start. Again, it tells us the what, not the why. However, we cannot stop there because quantitative data alone in isolation, it lacks nuance and it truly can perpetuate a deficit-based narrative about marginalized groups. So what do I mean by that? If we look at state interim assessments and we keep seeing that, for example, Black students are 3 years behind in reading compared to their white peers, that's just perpetuating a narrative because it doesn't give you why those numbers continue to exist the way that they do. So we cannot stop there. This is where we bring in the qualitative data. The qualitative data seeks to understand why and how we got the numbers that we got and why people behave in the ways that they do. So some ways that we can achieve that is empathy interviews. You have staff surveys. Some example statements for a staff survey would be, as a person of color, I feel valued and like I belong, right? Student surveys, I have a sense of belonging at my school. You could also shadow a student. You could shadow a new teacher. You could shadow a mentor teacher to identify their experiences within that school or in that district, okay? Those two things combined, quantitative and qualitative. Number one, it makes the voices of the marginalized heard. They feel valued, they feel seen, it's taken into consideration, right? So let me use that example that I just gave regarding if we only look at the quantitative data. Let's make it for interim assessments. Let's say that you are leading a school in which, or working with teachers that are in a school in which students of color are performing lower in comparison to their white peers. You could stop there, or you can then say, well, let's figure out why this is. And then you start going into classrooms, and when you're doing those observations, you may see things such as, oh, well, the teacher is only calling on white students to participate in the lesson, right? Unintentional. Again, I assume the best coming into this work, right? But they may be unintentionally engaging more with white students in that classroom and therefore pushing the thinking and cognitive load on the white students more. And when they're pushing that thinking, the white students end up learning more because they're being challenged more, right? And then that could come from a lack of belief that the students of color could rise to the occasion. Now you have an understanding of why you keep getting those numbers, and you have an entry point for a solution. I'm going to pause there. Any questions about this first step and how this work should be approached when you're trying to create change in your district in regards to equity? You can drop a question in the chat. You can take yourself off mute, whatever is best for you.
One question I had, Nadia, when you were unpacking the difference between quantitative and qualitative, I absolutely agree with you. I think there's in our education systems, there's an overemphasis on that quantitative piece. I haven't been on in any school in the K-12 space where people are actually collecting qualitative data. I think part of the issue around that is that qualitative data just takes more time on task. And I would be curious to hear your suggestions or how other schools and how other partners you've worked with are kind of addressing that, because it does take time. And you're pulling different focus groups, and how are those decisions made, and like what are the kind of nuts and bolts behind that?
That's a phenomenal question. And I think when you are trying to find time as someone that's incredibly busy in a school district, it's a matter of what you choose to prioritize. And that might sound kind of difficult to hear and to take in, but the reason I say that is, for example, I coached superintendents as well, and I coach, one person comes to mind, superintendent of a district here on the East Coast. He actually leads their empathy interviews. Things to the side on his calendar, and he goes into his high school is where he was seeing some of the challenges. He goes into his high school and he talks to the students, right? He's the soup. He's incredibly busy, but he decided somewhere along the way that this was important enough for his district that he wanted to be the person that's going in and collecting this data. It's a matter of what can you prioritize. So that would be my first thing, because the reason that is ideal is because considering like the definition of anti-racism, it's no longer useful to say like, I'm not racist and I don't engage in racist things, but you have to put some action behind that, right? And so him putting the action behind it shows his commitment to, I want to be one of the people that creates this change. So that would be ideal. A secondary option would be calling in an outside person, right? Would be call if your district or school program, et cetera, is truly completely strapped and you can't find the time to do that. The benefits of calling in an outside person is that you're likely going to get a more unbiased view because they have no stake in the game, right? And so having someone that works at one of the school campuses inside the program, you might come out with some bias in the outcome of the data. You may not, but that is one of the benefits of calling in an outside person to conduct those if the need be. Yeah, great question. So in a moment, we are going to go into breakout.
Dr. Bennett, we have a couple comments here in the chat.
Hey, thank you very much for that.
Just want to make sure we, before we move on. Oh, that's another thing that Dr. Kate's question, that was another thing I was wondering too, like, how do you know, what to look for and what observational data to collect, especially if you aren't coming from that research background, like what?
Absolutely. So I'll give another example, but then I'll also give a great resource. I'm big on giving people resources, right? So I have a principal that I work with that he chose the option of shadowing a student. So he's dealing with low expectations within his school, and he wanted to shadow a student to understand the difference of an experience in a day of a student that identifies as Black versus the day and experience of a student that identifies as another race. It could be Asian, white, Latinx, et cetera. And in his observation, he observed things such as the student that identifies as Black received about 4 times fewer positive statements from the adults in the building throughout the day than his peers. And I'm not even referring to the classroom positive statements. I'm referring to simple things such as good morning. How are you doing? How was the basketball game, et cetera. He found that very few adults in the building were truly engaging with him to understand him, to see him, for him to feel valued and seen as a person. Right. And so that's another way to gather qualitative. Now, if you do that, you would obviously need some comparison data, right? So you would need to not just observe that student, but observe several other students so that you can have an accurate comparison. But a great resource for that, there's a book, Coaching for Equity, that I recommend, that gives a bunch of not only examples, but rubrics for conducting this kind of qualitative feedback, empathy interviews, observations, as well as student shadowing. So I would definitely recommend that. And I gave the example of the in-classroom example, which is student participation and engaging with them and pushing their thinking more. I'm going to build on that one a bit because I see that a lot, is that in addition to engaging with them more, we've observed Black students, and as well as students identify as Latinx, being able to opt out at a higher rate, which is concerning for obvious reasons. And that stems from the teacher not believing and that they can actually answer the more difficult questions or engage in the more difficult work. So they're allowing them to opt out. So that's another thing to look for in regards to that qualitative data. All right, I'm going to look in the chat. Let's see here. Okay, so what Marissa brings up a great point that I will build on regarding people of color being pursued for leadership opportunities. So my doctoral studies was actually on the lived experiences of Black women superintendents. And something that I found in my study is that Black women who rose to the superintendent position actually consistently observed there being a clear system, process, or person for people that do not look like them to rise into leadership. It was oftentimes like a given in that people would actively seek out certain individuals and ask them if they want to be in leadership, offer to mentor them, etc. That is not happening for Black educators in a consistent way. It is just not happening. Oftentimes, what my research found is that the Black educators that are sought after for leadership are like superior. I'm talking about someone who's so good at their job that they cannot be overlooked. And oftentimes they are the only people that are sought out versus a person that doesn't identify as a person of color. They don't actually have to be superior at their jobs. They just have to have a willingness to do it and work hard, and somebody will take them up and say, okay, I'll mentor you and I'll help you to get to where you want to be. That's not happening for people of color in a systemic or consistent manner. So when we look at the lack of people of color in leadership positions that have been teaching for an extended period of time, it does become a matter of who saw me, who sought me out, who took me under their wing. That's not happening for educators of color in a consistent manner. And so however you can do that, I strongly, strongly encourage it, because research does say that it can make a difference. Okay? We are going to go into some breakout rooms. And so we've talked about a few different things. We have talked about different ways to approach creating equitable programs that create change, qualitative as well as quantitative data. We've had a touch point on the history of the Black educator workforce, how the human brain works, etc. Now is an opportunity for you, as the brilliant individuals that you are, to take this information that's been given to you and begin to think through how you can use this information to transform the current approach, right? So we took the survey in the beginning. You said that we have boomerang equity, or we have just doing equity. How do we change that within your program, considering the things that we just covered, right? You are going to have about 7 minutes in your breakout rooms, 3 people to a breakout room. Please, you have the questions in the chat. Thank you so much for putting them there. And we're going to pop in, and then we're going to come back in 7 minutes, and we're going to do a quick share out. All right, beautiful. So I did get a chance to pop into some of the breakout rooms, and thank you guys. Great dialogue for the rooms that I was in. You're all talking about the right stuff. I am going to ask Amy Bennett as well as Aaron to share some of what they were discussing. By the way, Amy, great last name. Just throwing that out there. But could you share a bit of what you guys discussed in your breakout room?
Sure. Some of the stuff I was saying, we were just sharing about the power that data can yield, the right data can yield. And I was talking about in my past experience in running a large urban teacher residency in Central California. I did that work for about 6 years. Data was a huge piece of the program and how we were making revisions to the work that we were doing. We collected a lot of quantitative data around our diversity numbers for our residency candidates, for our mentoring candidates. I feel like the qualitative data, we were trying to do more of that. And I feel like we were getting at it for our residents of color. We had focus groups and survey questions that were really assessing their sense of belonging within the cohort, whether or not they felt valued as a co-teacher on their training campuses, the level of support they were receiving, maybe any barriers that they had encountered. The mentoring side of that, I don't feel like we did as thorough of a job. We tended to really live in their feedback on programmatic aspects versus their experiences as a mentor of color in our program, and really diving deep into their lived experiences at their school sites, which were the training sites for our campuses, to really get a full picture of what that looked like for our candidates of color, being housed on those campuses, the support, the collegial relationships, et cetera. And so those were just some of the things that we were talking about in our group. I'll pass it over to Erin, who also had some wonderful things to share.
So what I was sharing was we have a lot of quantitative data, and it's very clear where our gaps are and where the discrepancies are, but we're very new at this. And in terms of what I would consider qualitative data, at this point, I think it's just speculative. It's just kind of a hunch, like what we think is the reason why. So what we definitely need to do moving forward is develop some of these ways to measure that so that we can look at the why and start looking at the solutions. And I was so grateful to hear Amy share, because when she talked about the surveys being a little too heavy on just program data side, it made me think, okay, now I need to kind of tackle it more in that way too, where yes, it's important that we get the feelings about the program, but then also kind of looking at just some other areas that we can explore that aren't just related to the program. So we definitely have a lot of work moving forward ahead of us, and I'll be very curious to kind of uncover that why so we can start moving forward with the solutions.
Love that. Thank you so much for sharing. And would anyone else love to share? I didn't get to pop into all of the groups, but if there were insightful reflections that were shared in your group, I would love to hear kind of some reflections, but then also if anyone is already thinking about like, how do we jump into action and what we can change? So we are going to continue with the path that we are on. And the next step, step one, as we covered, was around the data, right? Quantitative and qualitative data. Now we get into the part where we're assessing the why. Now, this is going to get a little complicated. You guys stay with me. There are two ways that we assess the why, right? The first is what we just covered with the qualitative data, and that it tells us the why behind the quantitative data. That's the first why. Then we have another layer of why, in which we get to the bottom of why the qualitative data is showing up the way that it is. Okay? So as leaders, I'm sure that you've heard of the process of asking why 5 times until you get to the root cause of something. We're going to go through that process now. And I want you to kind of take note on how it pushes an individual's thinking, but then also continue to give you data for an entry point to a solution. Is Dr. Michelle back in the room? There she is. Guys, we did not plan this, all right? we did not plan this.
You're gonna put me on the spot, Dr. Bennett?
I'm absolutely putting you on the spot. So let's show some virtual love to Dr. Michelle ahead of time, because she's going to go through this activity for us. Let's smile and clap and tell her that she's awesome. I would love for you to walk through this scenario with me. So you're going to think of a scenario within education, right? That you have experienced, that you have seen, that we can use the process of assessing the why. And we're gonna walk through it together. And there's no wrong answer. Don't worry about it. But I knew you could handle being on the spot. So give me the scenario or the problem that you are trying to navigate as a leader in education.
So I'll go back to my classroom days and thinking about, working in Southern California, 5 miles from the Mexican-American border. 70% of the school that I work at is, English language learners. So there's a large population of English language learners. And one of the things that we are finding is that they, when we're doing our assessments, they're just not reading at the level of their non-Hispanic counterparts. They consistently underperform scores under grade level, especially in the first and second grades, when we know that those reading scores need to be proficient readers to move up and excel in the later grades of their experience in primary grades.
Excellent. Thank you for that scenario. So have you observed the classrooms to gather maybe some qualitative data as to why you may be seeing that quantitatively?
Yes, I have observed a couple of things that I notice is that, oftentimes students are grouped in homogeneous groups when they're doing their reading practice. And so if you're having a student that's performing at a lower grade level, what I've noticed is that they remain in that lower performing group for the entire trajectory of like their first grade and second grade year. So they're placed in that group and then they don't ever actually move out of it.
Okay, well, tell me why is that happening?
I think they're placed in that group because one, they're placed homogeneously in that group because um, they score they score a specific way in an assessment, and they have specific needs in regards to phonics, and everybody in that group has the same needs, and so we group them together to work on a specific core set of like phonics skills.
Okay, so thank you for sharing that. So, but we know that there's research that says that students that receive our English language learners would actually learn better if they were in heterogeneous groups, right, amongst their peers and having that exposure throughout the day. So if we have that research, why are we still placing them in those groups?
Am can I am I allowed to move out of character now, or can I be in
You can move out of character. If this
well, I think part of the problem is that we don't believe, we don't, I think part of the problem is that we don't intrinsically believe that they're capable of moving out of that group. I feel like um we're keeping we're in some senses, I don't know, coddled isn't the right word, but we're putting them in this group because we think that we need these specific skills. But what that's just doing is putting them in a track and staying in that track for their whole rest of their first grade or second grade years, when they need to be exposed to grade level text in addition to, you know, that's scaffolded so that they can learn those phonics skills that they need, but also be exposed to that grade level text and kind of move them forward.
You are 110% correct. And first of all, thank you for sitting in that seat. The process, right? If you had not come out of character, right, it would be I would continue asking why until you yourself come to that realization that that's actually the belief of which you're operating under, right? So if you share that you know, they're in the groups, they work better in those homogeneous groups, this is what the scores say, and I presented the research to you and you were like, well, hold on now, right? And that's what typically happens, right? But we're just doing a you know, a role play, but that's actually what's happening. And if you are in this situation when you're asking why, you're not actually going to allow the person, there's no jumping out of character. I actually want you to explain why, if the research says differently, if the research says that they need to be exposed to grade level text. If you know this information as an educator, why are you actually doing the exact opposite?
No.
Right? And you keep asking why until they don't know how to answer. They don't know because they don't actually know why they're doing it. You, as the person that's becoming the expert in this work, you know that they're doing it because of that foundational belief that she just shared. You don't believe that they can do it. But we want to lead them to that understanding and not tell them that that's the challenge that they're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense, everybody? Right? All right, I'm seeing some head nods. So you want to do the, like I said, the two layers of assessing the why. You have your qualitative data, and then you have the asking why 5 times until you lead people to the true understanding of why they're continuing in a practice that's not actually benefiting young people. I have a recommended reading here for you, but before we do that, because we have a little bit of time, I'm also going to take a couple of questions about either the why process that we just walked through or anything else that has come up for you. This is an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you may have. And you can put those questions in the chat, or you can come off mute and share with the group.
I have a question. I'm just wondering if when you were going through that process, the why, asking why, I was thinking the answer that I kept coming up with myself is because it's like, well, there's two reasons. Like it's easy. It's just easier to do what we've always done. And like time. And I wonder what you would say about the influence of like just the scheduling of a teacher to like even be aware of the research and then even understand like what steps to take to like disrupt the status quo, you know, like I'm just those are, you know, as a teacher, when I was a teacher, I always was trying to like do the right thing, but I didn't always know what that was. And I was like a special ed teacher with very little time to even think or change any systems. And so I just wonder what you have to say about that.
That is a great question. So particularly for a newer teacher, supporting them with managing their time effectively, that is support that we just need to give teachers, right? So if the issue is, I just don't have the time to, you know, figure out these groups or pair them with the right individuals, et cetera, then as a support person, I would highly recommend the first step being like sitting with them and helping them to figure out how to manage their time. You could even sit with them and help them plan out the groups. Give them whatever would help them to give the children what they need. Because we don't ignore the fact that teachers are limited on time and they're doing very difficult work. In response to the question of it's just easier, if you got into education because you thought it would be easy, then you're in the wrong field. And truly, after many, many years of leadership, assistant principal, superintendency, I got to the point where I was just saying that to people directly. Because it's not easy and it's never going to be easy. I'm not saying that anybody here should do that. I'm just saying that people need to kind of digest that truth. You're right, it is hard. I am here to support you through this difficult work, but we have to give the young people what they need. Now tell me how I can support you with that. Right? Somebody reflect what they're being required to do by leadership. This means resisting the system. Right. So if you are observing that they're being required to do something by their leadership that's not a research-based practice that's proven to be effective, I would figure out how to make that known within the system. Because you're right, if it's the leader that's asking them to do it, it's not the teacher's fault, obviously. But that you would need to make that known within the system. That's not something I would recommend anybody ignore. Because leaders can get it wrong too, and that's okay. It's not okay, but that happens. But I would recommend for trying to figure out how to make that known. The goal is like, don't ignore when young people are not being served in the way they need to be served. We don't ignore that. We figure out how to navigate those difficult conversations, but we don't overlook it. So I'm going to pause and I'm going to actually end this here, not pause. There is a recommended reading that's on the screen. A colleague of mine that I worked with some years ago, she's absolutely brilliant. She did her doctoral studies on supporting and retaining educators of color. It is now a book. This book is very, very practical. It's very practical. It's a quick read. And if you want to dive into and better understand some of the research-based reasons why people of color are either not staying in the profession, have challenges with getting hired in the profession, a lack of support that they're experiencing in the profession, I find this book to be a great resource. So with the work that you're doing, I think it's just a book that you can add to your catalog to support gaining more understanding around the experiences of BIPOC individuals in the education field. And with that, my time is done.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Bennett. That was so amazing. So many things to think about and reflect on, like systemically and just in like the day-to-day work that we all do.